All right, we're recording. How you doing today, Julie?
I am doing great on this fall day in Chicago.
Yeah, it's surprisingly here in Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan, it's been kind of dreary and rainy. But today's nice. It's supposed to be 70 some degrees today, so I'll take it. I'll take
Yeah.
the warm weather when I can.
All right.
Um, Now you are here on the podcast because you are releasing a book here soon. It's on the screen, Twice a Daughter.
Uh,
Um,
Actually, that's the first book,
that's the first book. Okay.
and that's one that we're going to like talking about because it relates to the second book, which is called Belonging Matters: Conversations on Adoption,
Oh, okay.
Family, and Kinship. They're kind of like a companion set. Um, One is my memoir about searching for my birth relatives, and Belonging Matters are essays about being adopted and the search and fun stories about family.
So, were you in the foster care system?
I was not. So I'm older than you are, which means the foster care system in the state of Illinois had not started yet. Everybody, like I was adopted through an orphanage. And then in the 1980s, they closed all the orphanages in Chicago, and the Department of Children and Family Services got started. And that's where the foster care system really took off in Illinois. So I'm too old to be part of that. But I mean, when you think about what an orphanage is, um, I do believe it's probably better to be in a family when you're starting off your life, but there's still that whole bonding issue. My sister and I were infants. I'm an identical twin. So we bonded with the staff in our orphanage and then got placed in a family, and the adoption was certified by the court system like 10 months later.
What is it like growing up in a an orphanage? I mean, because we've seen movies. There's been a lot of movies on the orphan be like growing up in an orphanage and what it's like. You get bullied. You almost feel like it's a survival type of environment. Was it like that for you?
Well, tell you the truth, I don't remember anything about the experience because we were infants.
Oh, okay.
Um, but what is fascinating about your question is when I was going through this process of trying to make connection with my birth family, I actually contacted Catholic Charities, who was the adoption agency, and hooked up with a social worker who took me back to our orphanage,
Wow.
and we got a tour, my sister and I together. We learned all sorts of things about what our life was probably like. They had an infant nursery, they had a toddler area, they had live in caregivers and technicians. And she explained the whole adoption process with the Catholic nuns that ran the orphanage. So it's a beautiful place on LaSalle Street in downtown Chicago, which, if you're familiar with Chicago, that's like the Gold Coast. But it was a place where the policemen, when they had a foundling, would bring them directly to St. Vincent's. And the pictures that I've seen, there's a little book about the orphanage. Kids stayed there for quite a while. If they were not adopted right away, they could be there through, grammar school years. I have a brother that's 2 years younger than I am who was also adopted through Catholic Charities in St. Vincent's, and he was 6 months old when my parents adopted him. His birth mom tried to keep him. She was a single mom in the 1960s, which was not a cool time to be a unwed single mom. She did her best, and so he was a little bit older when my parents um, had him join our family.
What why were you placed in an orphanage? I mean, I'm curious about that. Was it that your birth mom or your birth parents couldn't take care of you? What was the reason for that?
So my birth mom was raised on a farm in Minnesota. She met my birth father when they were both teachers in an elementary school in Minnesota. Um, she got pregnant. He was Protestant. She was Catholic, At that time in our country's history, particularly if you were Catholic, whoever you married needed to convert. He didn't want to convert. He also probably didn't want to get married. So anyway, he kind of left her in a lurch. She was fearful of telling her family what her situation was. I think, and I believe she's correct, that they probably would have disowned her. So she and a friend took a train to Chicago, changed their names. So my birth mom operated under an alias, and they met with Catholic Charities, and they made this adoption plan that she didn't know she was pregnant with twins, by the way. So that was a big surprise to her. So she made this adoption plan and she went into labor. She was living in this women's home with her friend, and she never saw us. She never held us. She did name us. And then she disappeared. So, and that was the promise back in the late 1950s, 1960s, was that you would maintain anonymity. So when I came knocking on her door when I was 48, because I had a health issue, she was mad. She felt that her privacy had been violated, that Catholic Charities had broken a promise to her. She had used this alias on my original birth record. So the state of Illinois in 2011, which is when my story takes place in Twice a Daughter, had a change in adoption statutes. And people of a certain age, and I fell in that category, could access their original birth records, which I did do. And the judge also opened my sealed adoption records, which had my birth mom's real name in there.
Wow.
And we were able to find her. So she was a bit of a stinker from the get-go. So we reached out to her, and she was so mad at the intermediary and said, "No, I don't want anything to do with this. Don't contact me again." And then over time, she did soften and she recontacted the intermediary, and we got our reunion going. And she was very protective of my birth father's name. She didn't want to give it to me. His name was not on my original birth record, so I needed her to tell me in order to find him. She gave me enough of an accurate spelling of his last name that we took us a year and a half to find him.
Wow.
And he wasn't that cooperative either. My intermediary likes to say, you hit every roadblock that most adoptees face when they're trying to find out what their family history is. So I sent him a letter, and he responded similarly, don't contact me again, but here's your medical history, which is a bit of a conundrum because you're like, okay, you either are my birth father or you're not. He wouldn't say one way or another. I'm sure he had legal advice that told him that. But the gift that he gave me was telling my younger brother and sister, you've got two older sisters maybe out there. And he told them the circumstances. And my brother, being who he is, called me on the phone, and we figured out that we had an amazing connection. I knew his wife,
Whoa.
and he probably had met me over the years, and we did not even know that we were related. So that's the story that I tell in Twice a Daughter, how I made connection with my family, and my brother is very much in my life, and so is my younger sister, and we're having a lot of fun with getting to know one another. My birth father died suddenly. I never got to meet him. And my birth mom is still in my life, but I have a lot of trust issues with her based on some of the things that she's done over the years. She's very protective with who she tells that she was an unwed mother. That's still a really big part of her personality, that shame that society put on her, that she put on herself about having been, done this awful thing, first getting pregnant, not getting married, and then giving up two daughters. I'm a mother of four, and I can't even imagine um, that experience.
Yeah, th- that's that's crazy. I mean, because now like the societal norms, the way they would look at her now is with shame. People would be like, "How could you give up your kids?" Um,
Exactly.
but I'm curious to know because I kind of went through the same process of finding my adopted or my biological family, and the expectations like it's hard to know like what to expect. It's hard to really put yourself in that position of like, what should I expect in this situation? Should I come at it with like full open arms? Should I be skeptical? What was your reaction to meeting your biological family?
Like you, when I first sent out that letter to my birth mom, and I felt like I was going to be the lost child found, that she would welcome me with open arms. So this initial pushback of no, I don't want you in my life was devastating. I entered a peer support group through Catholic Charities, a group is still, because I still participate, birth moms, adoptees, and adoptive parents. And I think that group helped me to develop a better understanding of the obstacles that my birth mom faced in getting to know my sister and I. Um, but over time, she did soften, and she provided everything once we got together. I have family pictures, DNA analysis from her. So once she decided that it was okay, what still has been difficult for her is that she's in a retirement community, and if my sister and I go visit her, she does not let us sign in. She wants to control what she writes in the guest book because it's such a small community. She lives in a bubble, and she still, at 90 years old, does not want anyone to know she was an unwed mother. Um, Sadly, she's not like the current times, to your point, embracing it and saying, I have this daughter in my life, and she's come back into my life. And I'm so thrilled to have her in part of my life. That's the reaction that we want to get from them when we approach them. And uh, that's not what happens, unfortunately. And I think, fortunately for me, I had the support group to talk through all that. But I think our expectations are not realistic when we start off.
No, I completely agree with that statement because when I found my biological mom, it was like such a moment of relief for me. I was like,
Mhm.
yes, like I found my mom. Like I was always a mama's boy. And then I was taken away at 9 years old, placed in a foster care home, and then adopted at 11. So at that point, I didn't have anything to do with my mom. So to find her, I was like, yes, like we can be together again as a family. And I again thought she would, be welcoming with open arms, but it was something to where like she was almost and still is. She's stuck in this moment of like grief and almost like she had experienced a loss that she could never recover from.
Mhm. It's
And
trauma.
it's
Yeah.
trauma. And even to this day, whenever I see her, it's she brings it up. She's always, like, well, I just couldn't take care of you guys. It's something that's always in the forefront, I guess, of every moment that we have together.
And when you offer forgiveness to her, that you understand or you've made peace with that, how does she react?
Um w- I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I've told her over and over that it's okay. It's okay, we have better lives now. We can move on. But I don't know. I mean, I guess she just doesn't accept it. Maybe it's because of the shame that and the trauma she experienced. She just can't get over it. I don't necessarily know. I can't really answer that question, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Um,
you're not inside her head. So
yeah, and when I do see her, it's not very often. So, but whenever I do see her, it's moments of sadness, I
yeah.
guess, for her.
Yeah, and I think their reaction to us is so much more complicated than sitting down with somebody else, because when they look at us, they see their own shame, they see their own faults and failings. And so our contact with them is not pleasurable to them, unfortunately. And I've come to that awareness with my birth mom. It's easier to talk to her on the phone and share a nice conversation and catch up. But to physically show up is, you can just see it in her body language. It's like it's another reminder of something that didn't go well in her life or a bad choice that she made. And it's sad. It's sad that just a person represents somebody's failures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I can't even imagine what I mean, your situation is different than mine, but like from my situation, I couldn't even imagine putting myself in my mom's position. Like she was 28 years old when she lost four children.
Hmm.
I'm 30 years old. I have children, and if I were to lose them, that would devastate me.
Yeah.
So I couldn't even imagine like what that would do to me. However, I do think that when I did have an opportunity, I would try to make the best of it.
Yeah.
But
My husband was a Vietnam veteran, and when I was going through this process with finding my birth relatives, we had a hypothetical conversation. If you had fathered a child while you were over in Vietnam and that child came into our lives, how would we react to it? And I said with open arms, because this is your child, and the same. So I think we're at different places in our lives when we can welcome things like this happening.
right, right. That actually happened to me. I talk about it in the podcast where I had a child with a woman and didn't know about it until he was 3 years old. And I was already married, and my wife had to we had to have that same discussion.
Hmm.
But unfortunately for me, after going to court and everything, the judge, because Michigan has a law where you have till the kid is 3 years old to establish paternity rights.
Ah,
And if you don't establish within that 3 years, and there's already an established father, then there's really not much you can do. So because of that, I'm unfortunately not able to be a part of his life. But yeah, we had to have that discussion as well. And I think if you can look at the situation for what it is and just try to, from that point on, make the best of it, then I mean, that's the best you can do.
right. But there's disappointment there because obviously you're responsible, and had you known, you would have incorporated your child in your life, and you still be able to. I mean, look at what's happened to us later in life. We're connecting with family members, so um, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for you. You might have to keep doing this podcast for a while.
Well, I plan to. So but I appreciate people like you who are making a difference in this community, because when I started this podcast, I started it as a way to share my story of growing up in the foster care system. And I honestly, I started it almost with kind of wrong intentions, because I felt like I had been done so wrong in that, from that community, from the foster care system, from social services, all that aspect. So I wanted to highlight all the negative stories. But
Hmm.
then somewhere along the way, I started highlighting positive stories. I started highlighting people that like overcame these challenges. And then now I'm talking to you, somebody who is actively in this field, somebody who has written many stories about their situation. What kind of response have you had from you writing these stories from that community?
Well, I'll try not to lose it and start crying. When I first started writing my story, it was because it was crazy up and down and all these obstacles. And the next step, I used 5 different search angels to find both of my birth relatives. Everything from a genealogist who really broke the case in finding my birth father,
Wow.
and people encouraged me to write the book, and it was a challenge to me. I mean, I had always wanted to write, but I didn't certainly think adoption was going to be the first thing that I started writing. um, but as I told my story and I put the book out there, it's been out there twice. A daughter's been out for 2 years. To a person, the emails and phone calls and messenger on social media platforms are people like me, my age. I'm 64, who didn't know how to even go about finding out who they were. And so there's a piece of my story that connects with everybody. Some people have tried DNA and they cannot find any family history. Some people have used genealogists. Some people have used search agencies, and there's some bad ones out there. I got taken for several $100s from an agency that really didn't do anything. So, and I share that in the book because I want people to learn from what I did right and what I did wrong. And I also want them to feel inspired that, okay, I've got this roadblock, but I'm going to get around it. I'm going to try this and I'm going to get around it and try everything, because the day that I met my birth mom and saw her in person, um, truly one of the best days of my life. And I've had a lot of good days, but that coming full circle and seeing who you came from and their physical attributes and just meeting them, I had spent 5 decades wondering who this lady was and why we were placed for adoption, and all those secrets got answered. And there is no reason why people like me, adoption happened to me. So I like to say it that way. It happened to me. I had no choice. Um, we shouldn't have to wait till we're middle-aged adults with kids who we're looking at saying, okay, where'd those thick, stocky legs come from? We should know that. You
Yeah.
know, whether we choose to do anything with it, we should still know where we come from. And the closed adoption system, which produced my sister and my younger brother, we were giving nothing, no information, not even, ethnicity. So here's a good example. I look really Irish, freckle skin, pale, hazel eyes. I never knew I was Irish until I did DNA analysis with my half brother. The family I was adopted into, my dad was really Irish looking, um, very involved in Chicago's Irish culture. We did all sorts of things as a family. I identified with that culture. To find out I actually belonged to that culture, biologically, was a huge relief. You know, you go through life with this almost imposter syndrome, thinking, well, am
Hmm.
I really that? I know I'm supposed to think I am. Legally, I am. But now I know I am. And I hope that that more states, like Illinois is one of the groundbreakers. There's about a dozen now of states that allow people to access their original birth records. It's still so slow in coming for my age group and older. It's ridiculous. Uh,
Yeah.
New York has come into the fold. I mean, every year another state is allowing us access, but it's a real crime.
It's a very difficult thing for a or for anybody, for an adult, somebody who, I mean, because that's one thing. When I became an adult, at first I didn't care. I'm like, I don't care who my dad is. I haven't seen him since I was 3 years old. But then as you have kids and as time goes on, you want to know these things. You want to know about like where you come from. You want to know about your health, your health stuff. And that's how I ended up finding my dad. Was I did a 23andMe and ended up getting connected with with a second cousin, and then that kind of led into me finding my dad.
Hmm.
But yeah, you shouldn't have to do those things in order to get connected with your biological family.
Correct. Yeah. And I found out, that's my whole story started with a breast biopsy. And I ended up finding out that my aunt, so my biological father's sister, had died of breast cancer before she was 40. And
Wow.
had I not gone down this path of figuring out who everybody was and what the story was, now I'm screened differently, because of that family history, and my three daughters are too. So my obligation was not just for myself, but for my kids. To your point, as parents, we look at coming out of foster care, coming out of adoption in a different way than most people do.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, by writing these books, obviously you're sharing your personal story. What is your goal? Like, why are you writing these books?
Well, not to sell books because it's really hard to sell books
Especially
with
today, right?
Amazon and so many players in the market. But um, in the United States, there's between 6 and 8 million adoptees. Okay. And that means that those adoptees also have siblings, adoptive parents, and friends and family that love them. So the audience that I'm speaking to is huge. It's an international topic, it's a topic that's never going away. So any conversation that I can throw into the mix is going to help somebody like me figure out, how do I better my situation? I want to know if I have brothers and sisters. I want to know what my medical history is. I'd like to have a picture of my great aunt who happened to be a Native American. I mean, those are all the things that we should have access to. And so by speaking up and creating a conversation like you and I are today, we're making people that are outside that little constellation more aware of a subset and the issues that they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the best way to put attention on anything is to have a discussion about it.
Mhm.
And the more people that talk about it, the more things that get done.
I had a conversation with a friend when I was going through the search to find my family, a good friend who I really respected. And her attitude about what I was doing blew me away. Her attitude was, I was doing something wrong. I was being disloyal to my adoptive parents by seeking out my birth parents. And I just couldn't believe that she had that attitude. And I said, you know, I'm not being disloyal to my adoptive parents. They support what I'm doing. I have a health issue. I need information. What I'm doing is fulfilling my story. It's not disloyalty. And so those kinds of attitudes are out there that we need to dispel, and we need to stick up for ourselves.
Yeah,
Adoption, search, and reunion is not disloyalty. It is about the search for self, search for family, the search for information.
absolutely. That was something my adopted parents were concerned about when I found my biological family. They thought that I was going to essentially forget about them, and I'm like, it doesn't work that way. Like, I mean, sure, I'm finding my like who I am, my parents, I'm finding them, but if anything, I have just more people that love me and care about me. Like, I'm not gonna forget about you. Like, it's not gonna change the dynamics of our relationship.
Yeah, I had that same problem with my adoptive mom. It took her a while to come around. But when you think about it, you're a parent and I'm a parent. And I remember when I was pregnant with my second child, and I thought, gosh, how am I going to love another child in the same way that I love this first child? And then they're born, and you're like, oh, yeah, of course. And it's the same thing with, um, finding our other set of parents is our hearts are big enough to love a lot of different people. And it's not an either or decision.
No.
We shouldn't be put in the position to make it either or. And gosh, there's plenty of those stories out there too.
Yeah, I mean, and then for anybody to put those expectations on somebody like you or me or somebody who's searching for their family is a selfish act.
It is, and it's putting already more pressure on a very toxic situation. I mean, it's so
Right.
stressful. Didn't you feel like completely stressed out? You couldn't think about anything else when you were trying to find your birth father and get your medical history.
That's all I thought about.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was
My family was like, "Stop talking about this."
yeah, I talked about it for a while. I still talk about it because it's one of those things that like for me, it was a surreal experience where like you only hear about these kind of things in stories, in like movies. You only see these this type of, I guess, success stories in movies. And it happened to me twice on two different accounts,
Yeah.
which was amazing.
Yeah. Um, yeah, the day I met my brother for the first time was incredible. And what's so interesting about not the players involved. So the birth parents have a lot of issues at play. They're not ever really going to get along. But as siblings, we just have this need to connect, and um, there's no obstacles in our path in the sense that we didn't cause this fight. It didn't. It happened, but nobody has too much at stake. My relationship with my siblings is almost the same as the siblings I grew up with, and the siblings that I grew up with, except my biological brother and sister in my life too. So there isn't any drawing lines in the sand, gratefully, because that would make it even more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you had mentioned that you have a twin sister.
Hmm.
What is that like? Did you know about her growing up, or
Well, we were adopted together.
okay?
So we grew up together. And, being, well, we were told we were fraternal twins. And we look so much alike. It's crazy. And when we did DNA analysis 15 years ago, we found out we're identical. So somewhere along the line, that piece of information got messed up. I don't know if it was at the hospital or the adoption agency or what. Not that it makes that much difference, but as you know from having gone through searches, it's like every time a little gatekeeper gives you a wrong piece of information, it makes you even more mad. So there were a lot of little pieces like that I share in the story that, like, well, why do people just don't care to get this right? It makes a difference to us. Um, so yeah, it's been really, really fun. She and I worked on the search together. I wrote the book. She held my hand when I was really um, upset about a lot of things that happened with my birth mom and birth dad. Having her as like a built-in friend through life. I mean, it is a really interesting twist on being an adoptee, is being raised with a full sibling. It's a blessing. I
Mhm.
can't even tell you how much of a blessing it is, because being adopted is hard. But I always knew who I looked like. I would look
Yeah.
in across the room, and there she was. So we were pretty much a team in that respect. But it wasn't like growing up, we didn't really talk about it very much. I think we just left it alone. I don't know if that's denial or what have you, or just being a naive kid. It wasn't really my, it's not that my parents avoided the conversation. I mean, we did talk about it sometimes, but even between she and I, we would just say, well, what do you think happened? And then we invented this fantasy that our birth parents were high school sweethearts, and she was the cheerleader and he was the head football guy. And, they were going to college and they couldn't get married. And so that was our little fantasy that we latched onto. You can imagine when we found out what really happened, we were like, huh? So my birth mom was 26 years old. She was an adult. She wasn't a teenage, you know, um, back of the car situation that she got pregnant. She was an adult. They were coworkers, they were educators. And so to me, I think I like the teenage fantasy one better. Um, than the reality situation, because I feel like they could have made a better decision because they were adults, but they didn't.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, obviously they weren't planning on it coming back on them.
No, and I think people think twice now about hiding secrets because they do come back around, especially with DNA.
Yeah.
I have several friends that didn't realize until they did DNA that one of their parents isn't really their biological parent. And that's a whole nother identity issue to face when either you weren't told correct information or the parents didn't know. I
Right.
mean,
Right.
and then that goes back to who do you claim as your parents, which is some of the essays that I write about in this next book coming out next week, is the family that we claim sometimes is not even a biological relative. So I had an aunt and an uncle. They weren't my aunt and uncle growing up, and we were close to them. They took us on trips with them. We went shopping. We did all sorts of fun things, and I consider them my family, even though they're not. So kinship and family is a really interesting conversation. And I'm sure you have people like that in your life that you consider family, but you're not related to them.
Absolutely. There's so many people. And I think that for me, coming from a situation of being adopted and being forced into a situation in foster care, but being forced into a situation where I had to accept other people as my new family, it
Hmm.
gave me an opportunity to look at other people as with open arms and as a way to be like, oh, I can accept you too, and now you're my family. And so, like now, I mean, there's so many people like you had just mentioned that I look at. I mean, even friends where I'm like, that's like my brother, or that's like a family member. I would do anything for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, now, you had mentioned that you grew up as part of like the Irish community in Chicago. So you kind of have you had like a sense of identity growing up, and you were able to associate yourself with a group of people. But did you ever find yourself like struggling to? It's like I remember when I was went into foster care. I went to a whole new school, had to make new friends, and then everybody's asking me like, "Where'd you come from? Like, who's your parents?" Like all these different questions, and then you kind of feel like the outsider, where
Mm.
you're not, that you're not like, you feel like an imposter, I guess,
Yeah.
essentially.
Oh, definitely. You do feel like an imposter. So, my dad had gotten my sister involved in the St. Patrick's Day Queen Festival in Chicago, and um, I made it onto the Queen's Court one year, and I remember thinking to myself, "Wow, did guilt? Did I just take a spot away from somebody that really is Irish and deserves to be here, or do I deserve to be here?" And I was a teenager at the time, so I just kind of went, "Oh well," you know. But to my relief, I did find out that my ancestors are Scotch Irish. The other thing I found out, which goes back to your question about identity, um, on both sides of my biological families, I have Native American,
Oh,
a big Native American. So my birth father was one quarter Chippewa, and there's different Indian tribes on my birth mom's side. Not anything I ever dreamed I would find. And I'm still struggling to put that in my sense of identity. And I think that's part of the problem with foster care and adoption systems is we don't always grasp all of who we are, and we might want to latch onto those things. I find it incredibly interesting to be Native American. However, back in the era in which I was born, people tried to hide that. So if you were white and Native American, maybe 5 out of 6 kids would look white and one would look Native American. And so, they would kind of hide that fact. It wasn't something so much to be proud of to be a mixed breed. Now I understand that with my birth families. I get where they're coming from with that, but I'm embracing it. I wish that my birth father's name was on my birth certificate because then I could claim that I am legitimately Native American and I am like, 13% or something like
wow.
that. Um, so it's sad. I mean that we can't identify with our true ethnicity till we're older in life.
Yeah, and I mean, by that point, you've already established patterns and the type of communities you're involved in, and so it makes it more difficult to get involved into the communities that you learned about. That's kind of something I struggled with too, because my dad is from Honduras, so that whole side of the family who immigrated here, immigrated, right? Yeah,
Yes.
they immigrated here. They all are from Honduras. They're Honduran, and so I'm half Honduran, and so that's something that I never really, I mean, I knew that I was Hispanic, but it's not a culture that I was really involved in until even now. I'm not really that involved, but
Mhm.
I know more now than I did growing up, and I wasn't involved in that community whatsoever. So more not it's funny, like now I talk to talked to different people on the podcast, and I had just had a Latina lady on who was promoting an event here in Lansing, and she's like, "Are you Hispanic?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm Hispanic." And she's like, "Oh, you don't talk like you are." And I'm like, "Well, I grew up Caucasian, so I
Yeah.
guess that's kind of who I identify more with now." But
But the gift that you can pass on to your children is that they have that culture in their background, and they can choose to investigate it and explore it and think what they think about it. So
right,
I think that's a beautiful thing that you know that and that you're passing that knowledge on to your kids.
absolutely. What kind of influence did this your whole story have on your kids?
Oh gosh. So when I was going through the ups and downs of finding birth mom and rejection and finding birth father and rejection, my kids were mad that somebody would be treating me like this. They thought that I deserved better. My adoptive mom was, I'll use the word stinker again. She wasn't full in. You brought up the point, she thought maybe she was going to lose two daughters to this other set of parents. She did come around and we got through all that. But so my kids they were mad. They didn't want to see me hurt. And I respect that. It also changed how they dealt with their grandparents on both sides. My son did meet his biological grandmother, my birth mom, and I think he enjoyed that experience. But I'll share one other story. So when my book Twice a Daughter came out a couple years ago, I had advanced reader copies and I had give them to all the kids. And I was on a plane with my son and he's reading the book. And I look over at him and he is crying. And I was like, honey, what are you okay? What's the matter? He goes, Mom, I just had no idea you went through all of this. I'm so sorry. And I said, well, you didn't know because you were in college. I mean, you weren't living the day to day with me that I was going through this. So I think the gift of writing your story and writing your thoughts down, because a lot of things come out when you write something down, is our children gain some knowledge about us, about our struggles. They look at us in a different way, and it creates back to that topic, creates a conversation that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. What kind of impact did this have on your life writing the books? Did it change the way you thought about the whole situation? Were you able to kind of put everything back into perspective by simply writing?
Oh, the book has done amazing things for me as a person because my last child was getting out of the household. I was going to be an empty nester. All of a sudden, I'm immersed in this adoption search. I'm writing about it. People are listening to me talk about it. And now I have this cause in life, this purpose. I get up every day and I think, what am I going to write about today? What do I think about? I think about belonging all the time because I think that's a fundamental issue for everybody. We're always trying to figure out where we belong. Do we belong at the cool guys lunch table? Do we belong in this sorority or fraternity? Do I belong on your podcast? I mean, we're always trying to figure out how we belong and how we fit in and how comfortable we are with that.
Right.
And that I think is fundamental, regardless of age, ethnicity, anything, is this I sense of identity and sense of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you give speeches or anything? Do you talk to
I
colleges?
do. I talk to a lot of book clubs. I kind of like the smaller environment where we can have a conversation versus me speaking at to somebody. Um, and I do like to talk on podcasts. And I will talk in front of, like Catholic Charities had me at an event recently at my orphanage, and I did speak
Wow,
to a crowd of about 80 people about my story and the connection that I had with the orphanage. So, yes, I do speak quite a bit about my story. It drains me, though. I don't know how you feel about it. It's like you share a personal side of yourself, and it is exhausting.
very. Yes. Yeah, I've done a couple public speaking things, and every time afterwards, I'm like, "Whew."
Yeah.
But you have like you're reinvigorated because for me to share my story, it's such an honor. I'm like, I feel so good and so happy that I'm able to use my story in some sort of small way to help somebody else.
Hmm. Yeah, I came across, actually, this woman contacted me through social media, and she's a twin, and she's adopted. She was adopted with her twin. And we had this whole conversation. We've become really good friends, about going to interview her for my blog that I write, because November is National Adoption Awareness Month, and that's next week. And so that's one of the stories I'm going to spotlight for my blog. It's an important month for foster care too, as you know, because it puts the national spotlight on the numbers and numbers of kids that are still in the foster care system
Mhm.
waiting to be placed in a family.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What is um what is your goal with this book that you're going to release, and when will it be released?
It releases on the 1st, November 1st, in time for National Adoption Awareness Month. I look at it as a companion piece to my memoir, Twice a Daughter. There's a lot of things that I bring up in my story, that because of the scope of the book, I couldn't explain all of it. So the essays that are in Belonging Matters go into things like what happened when my birth mom denied me for the first time. What were the issues related to that? What were the tough conversations I had with my adoptive mom about finding my birth mom? So I have essays, on those topics in this book that comes out next week.
Wow. I'm gonna have to get copies of these books. Now, for somebody that's listening to this, somebody who is maybe going through the process or doesn't necessarily know how to even get started in the search for their biological family, what would you have to say to them?
Well, start with an adoption agency, a caregiving organization. See if there's a social worker that you can start talking with. They're very sensitive to the issues surrounding a search. Make sure that you are in a really good place in your life before you tackle something like this. For me, I was a very healthy marriage. There wasn't any complications going on, and it stressed me. So be prepared to be stressed, and also be prepared to pull back and take time out. Take a mental health break, go back at it when you're ready. It's not for the faint of heart. It's tough stuff. You really have to dig deep, and pulling away from it is not a cop out. It's just saying, I'm not ready to deal with this situation right now. I need to heal a little bit. I need some more tools. Um, and go out and get those tools. Don't be shy about asking for help. There's plenty of people like me. There's plenty of organizations on Facebook. There's a wonderful one called National Alliance of Adoptive Persons, and it's NAAP United. So it's birth parents, adoptive parents, and adoptees, all in community. They have support groups, virtual support groups. There's plenty of support out there for people that are thinking about finding out who they are.
Yeah, yeah, there definitely is, and unfortunately, though, they're not as highlighted as they should be. Because when I was searching for my biological mom, I didn't have any tools. I just did Google searches. That's how I found her. And
Mhm.
if I had had those services, if I had help, it would have made the process a lot easier for me.
I agree with you, David. I think that those tools are probably more prevalent in the last 5 years.
Okay.
And maybe one of the good things that came out of COVID was we had to develop all this virtual online support systems.
Yep.
So I think that they are there more ready than they were when I started out. I didn't know where to begin either. I didn't even really know people that were adopted because nobody talked about it. And now, like, I went to a high school reunion a year ago, and I ran into a guy, and we were talking, and I was telling him about my book. He goes, "What? I didn't know you were adopted." And he was adopted. He's like, "I'm just getting started with this." I'm like, okay, well, this is what I know. This is who I can connect you to. And we've become really good friends over this thing that we didn't know we shared when we were in high school. So, yeah, the conversation starters, you just never know what they are.
I remember when I was in high school, and this has stuck with me ever since. I was talking to a girl in class one day, and I was telling her a little bit about my story, some of the things I was going through at home at the time, because my adopted situation was not any better at all. It was a terrible situation, but I was sharing it with her, and she's like looking at me. She's like, I would have never guessed. I would have never known that by
Ah,
looking at you that you had gone through all of these different things,
yeah,
and that's stuck with me ever since. Because now I'm like, you shouldn't let your situation define who you are as a person, which is, I guess, good that she couldn't tell that about me.
yeah.
But in the same sense, you shouldn't shy away from it. You should embrace your story and allow other people to know and talk about it, because that's how things change. That's how people change their ideas about things, and that's how people develop ideas. And yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Oh, I agree with you. A lot of folks didn't know that my sister and I were adopted because, the first thing that they see is two people that look alike. They want to talk about how cool it is that you have a twin. And so the adoption conversation hardly ever came up. Um, and I think, to my credit or discredit, I kind of hid behind that. I
yeah.
hid behind the twin thing and didn't really explore the adoption thing until I was forced into it. And I think sometimes our brains protect us from what might be harmful. And I don't think I was ready to deal with any of this until I was a middle-aged person.
Well, it's a shameful thing too for a young person to have to tell their peers at school, like, I was adopted. And then they're like, why were you adopted? Was your mom a piece of
Oh no. And that's the other thing, is to say, well, I don't know. I don't know
Right.
why I was adopted. I don't know anything about those people. And that's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Nobody else is in that situation. Why are we? And you don't want to fess up about it.
Right. Absolutely. Julie, where can people find your book?
It's available. Both books are available wherever books are sold. You can find them on Amazon, of course. Both are available in all formats, including audiobook.
Did
Um,
you read it?
I like to shoot people over to bookshop.org, which supports the independent bookstores. So if you don't mind waiting a little longer to get the book, instead of 2 days, it might take 4. You'll support your local bookstore.
Very cool. Thanks for doing the podcast. It was a lot of fun to have you on and hear your story, and to kind of, I guess, bring some awareness around this. I would love to have you on in person sometime if you're ever
I
in
would
town.
love that. I live in Northwest Indiana most of the summer, so Lansing's not that far.
I think it's like a 2-hour drive.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can make that happen.
Yeah. Let's plan something sometime.
Okay, I'd
Uh,
love it. Thanks for making the time for me today. This was really fun. Interesting.
Absolutely. And I wish you nothing but the best, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks again.
Yep. Thank you.